hit record whenever you want, Dan. All right. So I was looking at the different aspects, different themes in this coming week's parsha. Well, this week's parsha, because we start reading the parsha for the next week, traditionally on Saturday night of the previous week. We're already in this parsha of Shalach. And the main story is the spies or the scouts. There's some other themes as well of somebody who was collecting wood on Shabbat, and why was he collecting wood? He's clearly doing something wrong, but what exactly was the prohibition that he was doing? And that's a whole chapter in itself. There's also mention of tzitzit. As a reminder, when you see the tzitzit, it should remind you not to stray, not to veer into idol worship or into lust or things like that. But going through doing this every year, you got to come up with new material. You can't just go over the same stuff again and again. All right. So I thought I would take a different track, and it's just one line that really there isn't much explanation given, but it got my attention. And that verse is right here. Elish Shemot HaAnashim Asher Shalach Moshe LaTorat Haaretz Vayikra Moshe LeHoshea Binun Yehoshua. Right, so it's talking about the spies or the scouts that Moses sent to Canaan to get a sense of what they're up against, and also it seems like the value of the land. Is it productive? Is it if we're going to go into battle to try to live there, what are we getting? So it mentions that these scouts, they weren't just random people who were, who got the position because of their tactical skills, or being stealth or, whatever. It was that they were leaders. They were leaders of tribes. And it particularly mentions...
Not ready yet.
Okay.
It's 11:10. It's only 11:05.
All right. Shelley, I'm going to mute you for now. And then you can come back on. All right. So it mentions Hoshea ben Nun, saying that Moses called him Joshua, Yehoshua. Right? It doesn't change anybody else's name. It doesn't say why Moses changed his name. It just seems randomly puts that little bit of information in there, right? We see other names of other name changes in the Hebrew Bible as well. The most famous one is Abraham, and his wife Sarah, whose original names were Avram without the H, and Sarai instead of Sarah. Right, and over there explanations are given. And there's several other ones as well, and we'll touch on some of them as we go. So this is the example about Abraham from Genesis. V'yikra od Shimcha Avram, v'hayashimcha Abraham, ki avhamon goyim nisaticha. You shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. again with an H, for I make you the father of a multitude of nations. And I'll bring some commentators later that explain a little bit more how that name change makes that, changes the meaning of the name. One of the interesting aspects that I was actually reading this morning, and hopefully, I think we'll have enough time to explore it a little, is the biblical criticism perspective of how this particular line came to be in there, because it does seem somewhat incongruent, right? So that I put the link here. You can click it, I think, if you have a device that allows you to do that, and you can get a more full understanding of that perspective. I'll also put this in a comment with the YouTube video that's being made of this class. So we start off with Rashi, right? That's generally the commentator that traditionally we start with, the most prolific commentator. So he says, why was the name changed? Moses prayed to God about Hosea, that he should be saved from the counsel of the spies. Right? So it doesn't exactly explain how this name change does anything, except that the reason for the name change is to somehow protect him, not from the enemy, the Canaanites, but rather from his comrades, the fellow spies, who, as we'll see, come back with a negative report and say basically it's too dangerous to go, and he is going to disagree with them and say that it's okay to go because God is telling us to, and God will protect us. So we have one from the Ramban, commonly confused with the Rambam, right? This is not the Rambam. This is Nachmanides, not Maimonides. Moses said to Joshua, apparently, so this is the quote, Moses said to Joshua. So the Ramban says, apparently Moses called him Joshua from the day when he first began to serve him. Evidently, Moses changed the name of Hosea, son of Nun, to Joshua, is telling us that Hosea, selected to be among the spies, is the one whose name Moses has changed. Right? So he's addressing a broader issue here. Joshua is mentioned in other places earlier in the Torah, for example, in Exodus. And so why are we told now that Moses refers to him as Joshua when he was already referred to as Joshua, not Hosea, his original name? So the Ramban continues, the Midrash says Moses changed his name to make it a prayer. May God preserve you from the counsels of the spies. Right? Yehoshua, Hosea, like Hoshina, Hosea, is asking for God's mercy, and this somehow says that more. It tells us that Moses knew about the incident in advance, that the spies were going to give a negative report, or perhaps at that time Moses made the name change public, so that from that time on everyone would call him Joshua instead of Hosea. Right? Not entirely clear, but you kind of get the general gist. Jacob ben Asher, Baal HaTurim, Al HaTorah. Okay, I did not give her. So I tried wherever I could, where I'm bringing a commentator, to make it a hyperlink so that you can click into it and learn more about the person whose quote it's from. So if we click in here, it does not work because I'm in the I'm in the editing mode. Open link in new window. Share this tab instead. And here we get a little background, starting with the year he was born and the year he passed away. So it kind of gives you some perspective of where they're coming from, what time frame. I don't know if I got all of them hyperlinked, but I think I have the vast majority of them. Hold on. Present now. Go. Okay. And if anybody has trouble getting a hold of this document and wants it, you can just email it to me, and I'll be happy to send you the link. So according to this commentator, Jacob and Asher, he says, according to the simple meaning, Moses changed Joshua's name, for he had been the general of the army during the war with Amalek. Right? There was a previous mention of Joshua at the time of the war with Amalek, but according to this commentary, he was still known then, even though Moses is referring to him as Joshua, he was still known as Hosea or Hoshea, and coins were made with his name and were circulating, celebrating that victory. So Moses changed his name so that the Canaanites would not recognize him. Right? If they recognized him right up front, they would make him the prime target because he was known as a general. So this was basically to fool the enemy. Right? We see a similar explanation from the Tur HaOrach. Moses named Hosea, son of Nun, Joshua. According to the plain meaning of the text, his name was changed as he had been the commander of the army in the battle against Amalek. He had acquired an international reputation as a result of that encounter. Moses changed his name so that he would not be singled out as a target for the Canaanites. After all, they had never seen him, so I guess his image wasn't on that coin, but just his name. Had only heard about him, or if his image was on it, it wasn't a very good job. Rashbam explains, and Moses called Hosea son of Nun Yeshua. This does not mean that the people from then on called this man Joshua. It means that the man who had been referred to as Hosea son of Nun in his father's house was the one whom Moses now referred to as Joshua. The change had occurred already at the time when Moses appointed this man to be his personal valet. And so he's saying a couple of things here. One is that this was a change that had happened previously, but it hadn't been noted. And so now it's just being noted that, by the way, his original name was something else, even though we've been referring to him as Joshua. By the way, he also has another name that he was known by. And then it continues, it was customary to change the name of people who were promoted in rank. Right? So essentially the explanation here is not that it was a prayer to protect him from the other spies. It's not that it was to protect him from the Canaanites who had heard about him, but instead this was just a standard thing that when somebody was promoted in rank, they got a name change. Right? And so now the Rashbam has to back that up. So you're going to bring some other examples. We find this the first time when Pharaoh changed Joseph's name to Tzafnat Paneah. So this is in the Egypt story when Joseph is introduced to the Pharaoh from prison, and he becomes the viceroy. Pharaoh changes his name. We find it in Daniel 1:6 when Nebuchadnezzar's chief officer changed Daniel's name to Belteshazzar. So it had been a reference to a Babylonian idol, so named. Fascinatingly, the examples that they're using are from non-Israelites, right? From Pharaoh and from Nebuchadnezzar. So Pharaoh the Egyptian, Nebuchadnezzar the Babylonian. changing somebody's name, and suggesting that Moses did the same because that was the norm, not just in Israel, but across the board. The first time Joshua's name had been changed was in Exodus 24:13. Basically, the first time he was, I think that's the first mention of him. If anybody has any questions or comments, just jump in. Joseph ben Isaac Bechar Shar of Orleans, not to be mixed up with New Orleans, who was a Tosaphist. So this was after Rashi, right? We know at least one of the Tosaphists was Rashi's grandson. For the second half of the 12th century, he says, Moses changed the name of Hoshea, what does that mean? As the Holy One did to Abraham, Sarah, and Jacob. But Isaac was named by the Holy One to begin with, so his name did not have to be changed. Right? Doesn't really, it sort of seems to go on another tangent over here, except just saying that this is a common thing about name changes. But if God was the one who named the person, then God doesn't feel the need to change it again.
Rabbi, can I ask you a question? It's Jack.
Sure.
Don't sometimes people change names?
You are muted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I hear you.
Don't people change names sometimes to ward off evil spirits? Like if,
You on both.
am I clear? No.
You're in stereo. I think you guys have two devices going at the same time, but I did hear you.
Now I'm on again.
Yeah, you're good.
People change names.
Yeah.
Do people change names sometimes when someone is sick to keep evil spirits away or whatever, something like that?
I did that with my father when he had the surgery.
Absolutely.
You're on.
Who's is that? Is that you? You're saying that?
Iz's father got an extra name.
Yep.
When he was about to have open heart surgery.
Exactly. My grandfather did that. Yeah, it is interesting because I think people are a lot, at least in our congregation, but in general, people are a lot quicker to do like a Mishaberach. But that is a traditional thing. And, you know, I think the traditional understanding was that, you know, whether people really believed that this was going to happen or whether it was just a sort of hope and a prayer, was that this was going to fool the angel of death. The angel of death is looking for Chaim, you know, ben Sarah, and now it's Chaim Yankel ben Sarah, and the angel of death is confused.
Right.
Right. So yes, you're absolutely right, and that was something I was hoping to get to at some point, but I'm glad that you brought it in because that's a practical application that's still used. Right. But again, generally it's an add-on name. It's not a changed name.
It's add-on.
What's that?
If it is his father's case, it was an added name.
Right, and that's the tradition.
This is Shelley.
So
I just have two kinds of
Shelley.
two kinds of changing names. One is, you know, how Hollywood actors used to change their names so they didn't have Jewish names. And secondly, when my family first came to the United States through Rhode Island, the family name was Blechman, so nobody could say Blech. So the name was changed, I think, by an immigration officer to Blackman. And I think this was very common at the point of immigration. They just couldn't pronounce certain Jewish names, and they got changed at that point.
Which is interesting because a blech, what I know a blech as on Shabbat, people would put this sort of metal sheet, and some people still do, over the oven, over the stove.
Yes.
And have a little fire going, right, to keep the cholent hot or whatever it is.
Sure.
But it sounds like this immigration officer heard BL and it's like, it sounds like black.
Right, right.
And made an attempt to try to get an accurate translation.
Right.
Yeah, our name as well. I don't know exactly what the history of when it was changed was. It was Castellanets, as far as I know. And I think at some point when they came to this country, whether it was my great grandfather doing it himself or an immigration officer, it was shortened. And we know of many examples of that.
Right.
Other name changes are joining the Witness Protection Program. I mean, we can go.
Right.
Yeah. In the beginning, so the Mechilta, this source from Mechilta, so anything that's in italics like this is my own writing. Source of Mechilta is written in reference to the father-in-law of Moses, but it's included here. I included it here because of the discussion of name change in general and Joshua's name change in particular. In the beginning, Jethro was called Yether. And Moses went and he returned to Yether, his father-in-law. And when he added good deeds to himself, a letter Vav was added to his name. So kind of suggesting that this was a merit, like a gold star, you get an extra letter added to your name here. And thus you find with Avraham in the beginning, he was called Avram. And when he added good deeds, a letter Hey was added to his name, and he was called Avraham. And thus do you find with Sarah, in the beginning she was called Sarai, and when she added good deeds, a great letter, Hey, was added to her name, and she was called Sarah. This is a little more tricky because she's also losing a letter with the Yud, right? So that's why he has to add in here a great letter was added, not just a letter. And thus do you find with Josh, and we'll come back to Sarah in a little bit as well. And thus do you find with Yehoshua, and Moses called Hoshea the son of Nun Yehoshua. There are others whose names was diminished, right? And so this goes both ways. You can gain in your name, but you could also lose. Ephron in the beginning, he was called Ephron. When he took the money from Abraham, a letter was dropped from his name, and Abraham hearkened to Ephron. I think the English translation kind of loses the point here. Let me see if I can. So Shetchila Hayakarna, so Ephron, Ayin Fe Resh Vav Nun. Ayin Fe Resh Vav Nun. Oh, the Vav is taken out after. Okay. And thus do you find with Yonadav, in the beginning his name was Yehonadav, but after that deed, a letter was dropped from his name, and he was called Yonadav, as is written in Chronicles, when you befriended Achizayu. Hence the sages ruled, let one not befriend an evildoer, even to draw him close to Torah, which is an interesting little tidbit right there that we can go on a whole tangent, but I'm going to stick to the general topic. According to this quote from the Talmud, the following quote from the Talmud, Sanhedrin, part of a name can be taken from one person and given to another person. Right. This kind of reminds me of, this idea of like years of one person's life being added on to another person's life, which we see sometimes. So again, this is Talmud Sanhedrin, and as I've said before, anytime that we say Talmud without specifying whether it's the Babylonian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud, I'm sorry for the background noise, we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. So David requested, and I shall be clear from great transgression, meaning that my transgression with Bathsheba and Uriah will not be written in the Bible. Right? This is the famous story of when David is on his rooftop or whatever, and he notices a woman sunbathing, and he says, I want her. And there's only one problem. She's married to one of his generals. And so he sends this general off to the front lines in the hopes of him getting killed. That's exactly what happens. And he marries Bathsheba. But then, at some point he realizes that he made a mistake and he's asking for forgiveness. And then he wants to take it a step further. He's like, could you do me a favor and just take that off my resume? Don't mention that in my legacy in the Torah. God said to him, that is impossible. And just as the letter Yud that I removed from the name of Sarai, wife of Abraham, when I changed her name to Sarah, was standing and screaming several years over its omission from the Bible until Joshua came and I added the Yud to his name. Right? This is fascinating. Right? What does it even mean that a letter is, it sort of has its own entity, and it's, its feelings are heard or something. Right? And it's added to Joshua, Yehoshua. So that's where the Yud at the beginning of the word, as opposed to with Sarai was at the end of the name. As it is stated, and Moses called Hoshea, son of Nun, Yehoshua. Anytime Zahava says le, I've decided that means she's hungry. I know according to the experts that you can't necessarily differentiate cries, but, we have fun with it anyway. All right. Top portion of the transgression, which is fit to be included in the Bible, all the more so it cannot be omitted. Anyway, so I just thought that was an interesting part. And, one of the cool things when using this tool of Sefaria that you can do is there's a lot of different search options. So you can search a hashtag. And so I put in a couple of different hashtags as I was preparing, for example, Joshua or name change. There was no hashtag for name change, but there was one for name, which made it a lot more material to sift through. But I found some of these gems that way as well. Sometimes it is an add-on name and not meant necessarily to replace the original name, right, which is what we talked about. Following are a couple of examples. This is from the Talmud Sota. And Sota, of course, is the thing we talked about, I think, last week, a woman who's accused of adultery and this whole ritual that she has to go through to clear her name. It is taught in a Braita, right? So a Braita is generally an aspect that's more sort of commentary and less rules oriented. So in a Braita, according to the one who says that they were a woman and her daughter, because it is taught, and we'll just get some context in a second here. With regards to Shifra, who is referred to in the verse, this is really a reference to Yocheved. So these were the midwives in Egypt that the Pharaoh called and said, I want you to drown the firstborns in the sea. And they said, oh, no, we'd be happy to comply, but these Israelite women are so independent that they just give birth before we even get there. And she's referred to as Shifra, but according to this Braita, it was actually Yocheved, and she was called Shifra. And why was she called Shifra? Because she would prepare Mishaperet, the newborn. I deleted the Hebrew here because when you look at it in the library view, it would have saved some space, and I was planning on doing that, but then I started editing it right before the class, so here we are. So if you want to read it in Hebrew, you can just click that link right up top. That's a hyperlink. Because she would prepare the newborns. Alternatively, she was referred to as Shifra because the Jewish people increased and multiplied. Sheparu Verabu, or like Shefa, in her days due to her assistance. The Braita continues. With regard to Pua, this is the other midwife who is referred to in the verse. This is really a reference to Miriam, Moses' sister. And why was she called Pua? Because she would make a comforting sound, Poa, as she would remove the child from the womb of the mother. I have to learn a little bit more about that, apparently. Alternatively, the word pua is related to one of the verbs that describes speaking, as she would speak through divine inspiration and say, in the future, my mother will give birth to a son who will save the Jewish people. All right. Or HaChaim on Genesis. I didn't write an intro, so let me see. That's a long one. All right, we'll see how far we get with it. There's clearly a reason I put it in here. You will not be called Jacob, but Israel. Right. So this is in terms of. Oh yeah, now I remember. With Jacob, unlike with Abraham, it says you will not be called Jacob, but Israel, and yet we see further references to Jacob. Right. Unlike with Abraham, after it says that your name is changed now from Abram to Abraham, he's never called by the original name again. With Jacob, he is. We need to understand the difference between when God renamed Abram and when he renamed Jacob. In Brachot 13, in the Talmud of Brachot, it states that anyone who calls Abraham Abram, his original name, nowadays violates a positive commandment, right? So you're actually not allowed to. I mean, in the context of learning, obviously you need to mention it because otherwise nobody knows what you're talking about. Whereas it is permissible to refer to Jacob as either Jacob or Israel. Although our rabbis in the Talmud there point out that the Torah itself refers to Israel as Jacob after God renamed him, in view of the fact that we ignore the words lo yikra, you should not call, when it comes to Jacob, why should the same rule not apply to Abraham? And we should have the choice of calling him by either name. And it goes into kind of minutia, and again, this is sort of a tangent, so I'm not going to read the rest of it, but it's an interesting. It's a topic in terms of sometimes the other name continues, sometimes it's not done. Okay. And this is from the Talmud in Megillah, referring to Mordechai and Esther. The verse states, and he had brought up Hadassah. That is Esther. Right? So what's her name? She's referred to as Hadassah, and she is referred to as Esther. What was her real name? It is taught in a Braita that the sages differed in their opinion as to which was in fact her name and which one was a description. The Meir says Esther was her real name. Why then was she called Hadassah? On account of the righteous who are called myrtles, Hadassim. And so it states, and he stood among the myrtles in Zechariah. Rabbi Yehuda differs and says Hadassah was her real name. Why then was she called Esther? Because she concealed masteret, the truth about herself, as it is stated, Esther not yet made known her kindred nor her people. Rabbi Nechemiah concurs and says Hadassah was her real name. Why then was she called Esther? This was her non-Hebrew name. Right? Interesting. I mean, we can relate to that. A lot of us have Hebrew names, and then we have secular names, or whatever you want to call it. For owing to her beauty, the nations of the world called her after Ishtahar, Venus. Right? Ben Azai says Esther was neither tall nor short, but of average size, like a myrtle tree. Anyway, you get the general gist. And this is from the Talmud Brachot. Having mentioned the changing of Jacob's name, the Gemara addresses the changing of the names of Abraham and Sarah, which we mentioned before. What is the meaning of changing Abram's name to Abraham? As it is stated, Abram is Abraham. The Gemara explains, initially he became a father, a minister, and prominent person only to Aram. Right, so this is explaining in a little bit more detail, where it says, you're going to be a father to all nations, but how does the name change actually? How does it change the meaning? So the original one is, you're going to be an important person, but just within the nation that you're in. So he called Abram, father of Aram, and ultimately, with God's blessing, he became father of the entire world. So he was called Abraham, father of Hamon, right? And that means master of the masses, or father of the masses. As it is stated, I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Similarly, what is the meaning of changing Sarai's name to Sarah? The same concept applies to Sarai as to Abraham. Sarai is Sarah. The Gemara explains, initially she was a princess only to her nation, my princess Sarai, right? Which is it's like possessive, my. But ultimately she became Sarah, a general term indicating that she was princess for the entire world. Also with regard to Abraham's name, Barka Paratot, anyone who calls, okay, so this is going into that same discussion that we mentioned before about with Abraham, if you mention his original name, then it's a transgression. And I will not go into all of that. All right. Random interesting Talmud Megillah about the way some names are written in the Bible. And then after this, I'll just click on, I'll close out with the Bible criticism perspective. Talmud Megillah, the Gemara answers, as taught by Ula, as Ula said, whenever one's name and his father's name are mentioned with regards to prophecy, it is known that he was a prophet, the son of a prophet, and therefore his father's name is also mentioned. And wherever his name is mentioned but not his father's name, it is known that he was a prophet but not the son of a prophet. Similarly, whenever his name and the name of his city are specified, it is known that he was from that particular city, and whenever his name is mentioned but not the name of the city, it is known that he was from Jerusalem. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then this is from Rabbi Nachman of Breslov and other sources as well that talk about the name of a person or of a thing has great significance. That it contained in the name of each thing is its soul and life force. This is why when we call a person by his name, we gain his attention immediately. Right, and so saying that basically names are, not just an interesting, nice thing, but there's some greater spiritual significance to it. So let me just go into this. I have to edit link. Why doesn't it like me today? All right, I'm just going to go here. So this is the website, thetorah.com. Why was Joshua singled out by Moses? So they take a couple of different perspectives from the multiple author hypothesis. This is Rabbi Farber. He suggests that the source that's introducing this story didn't have the previous mentions of Joshua, and therefore this is the first mention, and so it needs to tell us, hey, by the way, Hoshea, Ben Nun, and Joshua are the same person. So that's one perspective, and then he brings another perspective, which is the redacted theory, which is that regardless of whether it was one document or multiple documents, but even if it was multiple documents, there were some editors along the way who noticed things and said, hey, we need to add something to make this coherent. And according to this theory, originally the names of the spies weren't written. And again, he brings his, the basis for these arguments in there. but it was added in later to show his importance and to explain, I think, why he was called Joshua. Then there's a few different pieces to it that I didn't really get to completely do, but I found it fascinating. It really, it's interesting to look at these things from the different perspectives. And we all come to our own conclusions anyway, but it's the different disciplines approach it differently, and I certainly find it more interesting. So that's pretty much it for what I've prepared. Any questions or comments? Okay. Yeah, so like I mentioned, there is the idea of a name change when somebody is sick, and if somebody finds that meaningful, they can do that. Generally, it's done kind of the same way you would do a baby naming, by a Torah reading, and I think for people who find that thing meaningful, it's certainly an option available.
Rabbi, it's Jack. I have one question.
Hey, Jack.
From what I gathered, Jesus' name was Yeshua or Yahshua. Is there any connection at all to us with that name?
When you say us, meaning this class?
No, to Jewish people. Is there any connection to him, to the name Yeshua, to the Jewish people?
So I'll take it a step further. It's very close to the main character that we're talking about right now, Joshua.
Yes.
Right? His name is Yehoshua, which generally means the same thing. Hoshea means save, like asking for mercy to save us, that sort of thing. Right? And so it's possible he had a similar name. It was probably a popular name. Names were used by multiple people, and that's why they would often be named, the son of so and so. Although we saw that other interesting part about it. They didn't have last names back then, but yeah, it's certainly. I mean, I think anybody who's even a little bit knowledgeable acknowledges that he was Jewish. The question is exactly, what happened, who's at fault, and all of that. But he certainly, there's no reason that he wouldn't have had a Jewish name. So yeah.
Okay.
All right. So that concludes the class. We, as you may have heard, the cantor is going to be leading. I assume it's going to be throughout the summer, but we'll see. But at least for now, he's going to be leading a class on Monday evenings at 7 p.m. on the ethics of our fathers. And that's from the Mishnah. It's a unique book in the Mishnah where it's basically just kind of different tidbits of advice and wisdom, as opposed to a more kind of structured, these are the laws of Shabbat, these are the laws of Yom Kippur, so it's, it has a lot of really good quotes, kind of things that work well in a meme or on a poster. It's kind of short, to the point, like Siag lachachma shtika, yearn for wisdom by keeping your mouth shut, basically, and different things like that. So please take advantage of that. And then services at 7:30 on Monday, services at 7:30 Thursday, and Kabbalat Shabbat at 6:30. And yeah, I think everybody's pretty much the usual, so we don't need to announce anything. You heard it all the other day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very illuminating.
My
Yes,
pleasure.
thank you. Sandy, stay on with me, please.
All right, guys. Take care.
Okay.
Oh, you know what?